Well, last week we started a new series on the life of Moses, but we didn't talk about Moses much. Instead, we set the stage for the story that we're starting today. The children of Israel have now been living outside of Egypt for a couple hundred years. They came there at the request of Joseph, who was responsible for the distribution of grain during the famine. During the duration of the famine, Joseph provided for his family, but the family is now over, and Joseph has died. Towards the end of last week's message, we read Exodus chapter 1, verses 1 through 20. It says, "These are the names of the sons of Israel," that is Jacob, "who moved to Egypt with their father, each with his own family. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Benjamin, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. In all, Jacob had 70 descendants in Egypt, including Joseph, who was already there. In time, Joseph and all his brothers died, ending that entire generation. But their descendants, the Israelites, had many children and grandchildren. In fact, they multiplied so greatly that they became extremely powerful and filled the land. Eventually, a new king came to power in Egypt who knew nothing about Joseph or what he had done. He said to his people, 'Look, the people of Israel now outnumber us and are stronger than we are. We must make a plan to keep them from growing even more. If we don't, and if war breaks out, they will join our enemies and fight against us. Then they will escape from the country.'" Now stop right there for a minute. Let's try to read in between the lines, because there's a lot of stuff in some of these stories that really isn't there. We've got to dig a little bit deeper. The new king says, "These people now outnumber us and are stronger than we are." I read that and I thought, really? So I did some research. We don't know exactly how long the Israelites have been living outside Egypt at this time. We do know that the total amount of time they spent there was approximately 430 years. But we don't know for sure how much of that time they were actually in slavery. So we're not sure exactly where this passage you just read falls into place. We know Joseph was 30 years old when he became ruler in Egypt, and he died at age 110. So let's just assume that what we just read happens 30 years after Joseph's death. The Israelites would now have been there, if we take the current rate of growth in the rural population, which doubles every 35 years, then the Israelites would have grown from the original 70 to 560 during that amount of time. If we give them the benefit of the doubt and say that they were more fruitful than most people, and so they were multiplying faster than doubling every 35 years, let's say they were doubling every 25 years. That means they would now be a population of 1,120 people. The king says they outnumber us. Let's push the timeline out 300 years. Let's say they've been there for 300 years now. Remember, they're there for a total of 430, so this would be pretty much towards the end of their time. If we multiply that by the current rate of growth in the world, we only come up with 27,000. Well, that is a healthy number. If we say they're multiplying doubling every 25 years, we come up with 290,000. Okay, now maybe it's something to be afraid of. However, I looked up to see what the Egyptian population was at that same time. The Egyptian population is estimated to be about 2.5 million at that time. So even if we take the doubling every 25 years and say they've grown to 290,000 versus 2.5 million, it hardly seems to me like they've really outnumbered the Egyptians. It's also unlikely the Israelites outpowered the Egyptians, because Pharaoh says they've outnumbered us and they're stronger than we are. We need to do something. First off, let's remember they were outnumbered by at least 10 to 1. Secondly, the Israelites had no army and they had no weapons. They were shepherds. They didn't know how to fight. Egyptians had chariots, they had armor, they had swords, they had spears. They were trained soldiers. But the king says they outnumber us and they're more powerful than we are. Really? The truth of the matter is the new king was hungry for power. A tempting political strategy for new leaders, whether it be an Egyptian Pharaoh or a Nazi Hitler, involves trying to solidify their power by singling out a relatively weak minority or an outsider group and calling them the enemy. There's no hint in the biblical narrative that the Israelites are anything but good, faithful citizens of the country. Yet the delusional Pharaoh imagines that the growing but still small Israelite minority in Egypt is more numerous and more powerful than they are. Or at least he convinces the people that that's the case. And his strategy works. Because in verse 11 we read this. So the Egyptians made the Israelites their slaves. They appointed brutal slave drivers over them, hoping to wear them down with crushing labor. They forced them to build the cities of Pithom and Ramses as supply centers for the king. If the Israelites were truly stronger than the Egyptians, there's no way they would have taken this lying down. They would have revolted and fought back. But they know there's no way they can win, so they do what they have to do to survive. They give in and they start meeting the demands of the Pharaoh. They start working for free. In verse 12, we read this. But the more the Egyptians oppressed them, the more the Israelites multiplied and spread. And the more alarmed the Egyptians became. So the Egyptians worked the people of Israel without mercy. They made their lives bitter, forcing them to mix mortar and make bricks and do all of the work in the fields. They were ruthless in all their demands. So based on the timing of when Moses was born and how old he is when he leads the Israelites out of Egypt, we can now safely assume that what we're at now, we're not sure what we read earlier when they actually went into slavery. We're not sure exactly when that happened. But we can safely assume now that now we're about 350 years into our timeline. They've been living in Egypt for 350 years because we know how old Moses was and history shows what year the Israelites left Egypt, that kind of stuff. All right, so going back, assuming the Israelites are still doubling every 25 years and calculating the Egyptian growth rate at the normal growth rate, so we're saying Egyptians are growing normally every 35 years. Israelites are more productive and they're growing every 25 years. We still come up with just over 1 million Israelites compared to around 6 million Egyptians by what history says at this time. So there's still a big difference in the number of Israelites to Egyptians, but they're still so afraid that they're deciding they have to do more. We can't let them continue to grow. I mean, there are slaves, they have no weapons, they have no army, but we've got to stop this because they're becoming more powerful. They're becoming too strong for us. So Pharaoh decides the only way to stop them from growing is to keep them from having babies. And if we just eliminate the baby boys, then, it takes boys and girls both to have new babies. So if we simply eliminate all the baby boys, we can control their population growth. So Pharaoh becomes a baby killer. In chapter 15, we start reading this. Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, gave this order to the Hebrew midwives. Shiphrah and Puah. How'd you like to have a name like that? Shiphrah and Puah. He said, when you help the Hebrew women as they give birth, watch as they deliver. And if the baby is a boy, kill him. If it is a girl, let her live. But because the midwives feared God, they refused to obey the king's orders. They allowed the boys to live too. So the king of Egypt called for the midwives. Why have you done this, he demanded. Why have you allowed the boys to live? The Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, the midwives replied. They are more vigorous, and they have their babies so quickly. We cannot get there in time. God has a sense of humor, doesn't he? So God was good to the midwives, and the Israelites continued to multiply, growing more and more powerful. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families of their own. This passage says Pharaoh gave instructions to the Hebrew midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, not to allow baby boys to live. Almost all babies at that time, no matter what culture you were from, were delivered by midwives. Hospitals didn't exist yet. Doctors really didn't exist yet. So babies were always delivered by midwives. Why it only mentions 2 midwives is unclear. Some Bible scholars believe that these two women were in charge of all the other midwives, and the order was given to them, and they were supposed to pass it down through the ranks to all the midwives and make sure that all the midwives followed the instructions. But it is possible that Pharaoh was only trying to slow down the population growth, not completely eliminate it. After all, if he took the life of all baby boys, it would drastically affect his free labor force. Maybe he just wanted to hold it because I need free labor, but, I've got to slow it down. So if we just have these two midwives eliminate those that they can, maybe, again, we don't have all the information. But regardless, the midwives refused to follow his orders. They knew that what Pharaoh was commanding them to do was murder, and they refused to be part of murder. Actually, what Pharaoh was asking them to do was to perform a post-birth abortion. Let them be born, and then if they're a boy, snuff out their life, and then just pretend that they were a stillborn. Now, the Bible commands us to submit to and obey those in authority over us. Romans chapter 13, verse 1 says, "Let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established." The authorities that exist have been established by God. Consequently, whoever rebels against authority is rebelling against what God has instituted, and those who do so will bring judgment upon themselves. Paul is saying to submit to authorities, and the authority that he's talking about here was Nero, one of the most evil rulers of the Roman Empire. This guy that's in charge that Paul's talking about when he says submit to authorities. This is the guy that took Christians, tied them to poles, and lit them on fire and used them as torches to light his garden at night. Very evil man. But Paul said, submit to the people who are in authority. Submit to the emperor. Submit to the governors. Even though they're not godly, submit. In fact, Paul said if we rebel against the governmental authorities, we'll bring judgment upon ourselves. But we just read in Exodus 1 verses 20 and 21 that God blessed the midwives because of their disobedience. Although Scripture teaches us to submit to authorities, there is a time to submit and there's a time to resist. God's law always comes before man's law. We're always to obey the laws of the land unless those laws are in direct violation with God's laws. Only when God's laws contradict the laws of the land do we have permission to disobey. As Peter once told the Jewish ruling council when they were trying to get him to stop talking about Jesus, he said, "We must obey God rather than men." Peter obeyed all the rest of the laws of the land, but when man's laws contradicted God's laws, then he said, "I'm going to obey a higher authority." We read that all throughout the Bible. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. The law said you got to bow down to the statue. They said we can't because we can only worship one person, and that's the true God. They refused because it violated God's command. Daniel, when he was told he couldn't pray to any God other than the king, what did he do? He defied that order because he wanted to worship the true God. When man's laws contradict God's laws, then we should disobey those laws. Sifra and Pua were rewarded by God because they listened to God instead of the king. One big reward was that God gave them children of their own. Now, normally the midwives were women who were barren. They could not have their own children, so they became midwives, or they became nurses or nannies to other people who had children. So what this probably means is God opened their womb, or maybe they were just unmarried at the time, and God blessed them with husbands. And now they had children of their own. But another reward that's not specifically mentioned here is they were spared their own lives. The king had every right to put them to death because they had defied his orders. So I believe that not only did God bless them by giving them children of their own, God also blessed them by giving them grace with the Pharaoh who allowed them to live. Now, Pharaoh, although he was an evil man, may have understood the predicament that he had put these two ladies in. He may have realized that to expect someone to take the life of one of their own was unrealistic. So instead he said, I can understand why they wouldn't want to do it, but the Egyptians, I've already instilled a fear in them. They're already afraid of the Hebrews. I'll deputize them. So he deputized all of the Egyptians. And he told the Egyptians, you do the job. You eliminate the boys. In verse 22 we read, then Pharaoh gave this order to all his people. Throw every newborn Hebrew boy into the Nile River. So every newborn baby boy you find, throw them in the river. But you may let the girls live. All ladies, aren't you glad? There are pictographs that have been found in Egypt from this time period that depict babies being fed to crocodiles. That's essentially what's happening here in this passage we just read. The Egyptian people, primarily the Egyptian army probably, is tasked with throwing every Hebrew boy into the Nile River, where they will be hastily devoured by Nile crocodiles. The Nile is full of crocodiles. How many babies were actually destroyed this way is unknown. But at least one was spared, because God had a plan to deliver the Israelites and bring them back to the land that he had given them 400 years earlier. And we talked about that last week. Why would God allow all of this to happen? Why would God allow them, his chosen people whom he had promised to bless? Why would he allow them to now be slaves? Why would he allow now the baby boys to be putting to death? Why would God allow that? He said he was going to bless his people, and I believe a big part of that, as I said last week, was because God was trying to get them to go back where they were supposed to be. It was not God's plan for them to live in Egypt. God had given them the land of Canaan, said, this is your land, and in this land I will bless you. Now we understand why they went to Egypt. It was during the famine. They went to be with Joseph. We understand that. But after the famine was over, they should have gone back to their land. And God said, you're not going to do it on your own, so I'm going to have to turn up the heat a little bit. I'm going to have to make you uncomfortable so that you're ready to leave, so you're ready to listen to me, and you will get back to my plan for your life. In Exodus chapter 2, we start the chapter with this. Remember, all this is going on. The baby boys are being fed to the crocodiles. They're still in slavery. All this stuff's going on. And now this is where we start getting into Moses. This is who we're talking about, Moses. About this time, a man and a woman from the tribe of Levi got married. The woman became pregnant and gave birth to a son. Now we find out later that this wasn't her first. She already had at least one other son, one older, and a daughter. Okay, so this is not the first, so it doesn't tell us all the information here in this passage. Okay, she became pregnant, gave birth to a son. She saw that he was a special baby and kept him hidden for 3 months. NLT says she saw that her child was special. Other translations of the same verse substitute fine, when she saw he was a fine baby, a goodly baby, a beautiful baby, a fair baby. Some translations say when she saw that he was a wonderful baby. I think every mother and father would use those same words to describe their newborn baby. Every parent would look at their child and say, so special, so beautiful, so wonderful. Every parent thinks their child is special. So why does it specify here when she saw that her baby was special? Certainly this mother couldn't be the only Israelite to think their baby was special. I think there's, again, more to the passage here than what we read on the surface. Hebrews chapter 11 gives us a little more insight into it if we move ahead. See, we can't always just take just one passage. We got to look through the whole Bible to see what does that really mean. If we go to Hebrews chapter 11, verse 22, it says, by faith, Moses' parents hid him for 3 months after he was born because they saw he was no ordinary child. Again, most parents say mine's more special than others, but they saw something there. They knew there was something. Theirs was not just the most beautiful baby that had been born because he was their son. There was something unique about this child. There was something special about this child. They saw he was no ordinary child, and because of that, they were not afraid of the king's edict. God somehow revealed to Moses' parents that he was special. They saw an inner beauty in him. They knew that God had great plans for him. I don't know if the angel Gabriel appeared to them like with Mary and Joseph, before Mary and Joseph, or before Jesus was born, and told them, hey, Mary, you're going to become pregnant, but it's going to be God's son. It's the Holy Spirit's going to be the father, and told Joseph what's going on. Even told Aunt Elizabeth and Uncle Zechariah what's going on. I don't know how God revealed to them, but somehow they knew. This child, God's got his hands on this child. We have to protect this child at any cost, because this child is not normal. This child is the one that's going to deliver us from this oppression. So they decided to do everything that they could to keep this child from facing the fate of all the other baby boys. I find it hard to believe even that this wasn't the only mother that tried to hide the fact that they just had a baby boy. I mean, no parent is willingly just going to say, I had a baby boy, here you go, do what you want. There had to be other mothers that tried to hide their babies. But they're determined, we're actually going to be successful in this. Now, how do you hide a baby for 3 months? Dress them up in girl clothes, so when they come by, look at our sweet little baby girl. Have you ever tried to keep a baby quiet? I mean, remember, they're living in tents. There's not even insulated walls, and I'm sure there are soldiers going around listening for cries of babies. And when the babies cry, they're coming in to check it out. How do you hide a baby for 3 months? That alone in itself is a miracle. God had to be with them to even keep him hidden for 3 months. I wonder if there were any other parents that succeeded. We kind of get the idea from reading this passage that this was the only successful child hiding that took place. Historical evidence doesn't seem to support that any other children survived. We see pictures of the babies being fed to crocodiles and all that kinds of stuff. But God had plans for Moses. So it's not only Moses' parents protecting him, God is also protecting him, because God has plans. And let me tell you something. You do not have to be afraid of anything, because if God is for you, who can be against you? If it's not your time to go, nobody can take your life from you. At the same time, if it is your time to go, you're going to go anyway. There's nothing you can do to prevent it. It is appointed unto a man once to die. God knows when your number is going to be called. And until that time, now that doesn't mean we go out and do stupid things and try to defy death. But we don't have to be afraid. That's what it says here. It says because they saw Moses was such, because they knew God had his hand, they weren't afraid of even their own lives. They knew God was going to spare them because God's plan was for this child to survive. Don't fear. If somebody wants to do something, don't get all worked up about it. Just say, God, if it's your timing, I'm ready to go. But God, if it's not your timing, I'm walking forth in faith. Because even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, because you are with me and you will protect me. After 3 months, his parents realized they weren't going to be able to keep him hidden very much longer. Everything they had tried, they did all they could do in their own strength, even though I believe God still had something to do with that. So now they had to put their faith in God and say, God, we've done our best. Now it's up to you. There comes a point in every parent's life when they need to say, God, we've done our best. God, we've done our best to raise them in church, to teach them the Bible, to teach them how to pray, to teach them how to talk to you. We've done our best to teach them right and wrong. Now, this isn't what it's talking about right here yet in this passage. But still, there comes a time when we've done all that we can do. And we simply have to say, okay, God, now they're yours. Let them remember the things we've taught them. But God, we release them to you. You protect them. You continue the teaching. We'll get to that in a minute because they actually did that a little later. But now they have to put their faith in God, say, we can't do it. Let's see what God can do. So in verse 3, it says, when she could no longer hide him, she got a basket made of papyrus reeds and waterproofed it with tar and pitch. She put the baby in the basket and laid it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile River. The baby's sister then stood at a distance, watching to see what would happen. Now remember, the Nile River is full of crocodiles. They placed his sister Miriam there to watch her baby brother in a basket in the reeds where there are probably crocodiles. Warren Wiersbe, in one of his commentaries on this passage, says it took real faith to put the child in the river, the very place where boys were being destroyed. Why didn't they hide him out in the desert somewhere? Why did they put him in the river where they knew there were crocodiles and where they knew that's where all the other baby boys were dying? That took faith to say, okay, God, there's dangers here. There's crocodiles here. Okay, God. Now, they weren't stupid about it. They put pitch and stuff in the basket. They're going to make sure it stays afloat. But actually protecting the child, that's up to God. Verse 5, soon Pharaoh's daughter came down to bathe in the river, and her attendants walked along the riverbank. When the princess saw the basket among the reeds, she sent her maid to get it for her. When the princess opened it, she saw the baby. The little boy was crying, and she felt sorry for him. This must be one of the Hebrew children, she said. Then the baby's sister approached the princess. Should I go and find one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you, she asked. Yes, do, the princess replied. So the girl went and called the baby's mother. Take this baby and nurse him for me, the princess told the baby's mother. I will pay you for your help. So the woman took her baby home and nursed him. Later, when the boy was older, his mother brought him back to Pharaoh's daughter, who adopted him as her own son. The princess named him Moses, for she explained, I lifted him out of the water. God definitely had a hand in all that transpired. But the Bible's very clear that it was also the faith of his mother and father. Without their faith in God, God couldn't do what he did. We have to have faith. God does the real work, but we have to have the faith. She obeyed the letter of the law, which demanded that every Hebrew boy be thrown into the Nile River. That was what the law said. Throw the baby boys into the river. She obeyed the law. She put her baby boy in the river. But she said, I'm going to do my best I can to keep him afloat. I'm not just going to throw him in there and let him sink. And then she said, okay, God, I've done this. I've even obeyed the law, but now you take care of him. She put it among the reeds so that it wouldn't be carried away by the current. And she had obviously done her research. She'd studied the habits of Pharaoh's daughter. She knew exactly what time and at what place the princess was going to take her bath. And so she put Moses in that place where he could be discovered. Even so, it took great risk. The baby's fate was still at the mercy of the princess. Would the princess follow her father's orders and have her servants throw the boy to the crocodiles? Or would she have compassion and save him? Moses' mother did everything she could. And then she said, okay, God, the rest is yours. She fully trusted God to intervene. So much so that she tasked Moses' sister to keep watch. I can't imagine her putting Miriam there to watch if she expected the little baby to get eaten by a crocodile. She had so much faith that God was going to deliver him. She said, Miriam, watch and see what happens. Charles Swindoll, in his book, Moses, A Man of Selfless Dedication, states this. He says, you'll never convince me that Jochebed, that's Moses' mother's name, we find that out later. You'll never convince me that Jochebed didn't rehearse the whole plan with Miriam time and time again. Where Miriam would stand, how she would act, what she would say. I can just hear Jochebed's voice. Make it look like a surprise, Miriam. Make it seem spontaneous. You can do it, honey. I know you can. And I'll be waiting. I'll be right here, ready to come. Can you imagine Miriam waiting by the river, watching that little basket, waiting for the princess to arrive? Because they'd rehearsed it. She probably knew even the exact time the princess was going to arrive because her mom had planned it all out. And if she had had a watch, which they didn't have watches there, maybe she was watching the sun to see when the sun was in the right position. And she'd wait, not going to be very long. Now princess is going to show up. She's waiting because she'd rehearsed it. She's rehearsing the whole thing over and over in her mind, wondering, will it really go the way we rehearsed it? Can you imagine being Jochebed at that time, knowing that little baby is in the hands of God? She's having full faith in that God's going to come through, but at the same time waiting for the evidence of that, waiting for Miriam to come through the door and say, Mom, it worked, our plan worked. Faith is believing in something that hasn't happened yet. I believe by faith. God promised it. See, somehow God had made a promise to them. They knew there was something about this child. And they knew it so much that they had their faith in God. God, we don't see it yet, but we already know it's going to happen. We're waiting for the evidence, but we trust you, God. We have faith in you. Again, Charles Swindoll in his book says, Miriam never mentioned that the Hebrew nurse happened to be the baby's own mother. Certainly not. The girl had practiced making it all seem casual and impromptu, as though she were saying, oh, goodness me, look at that, a baby. Perhaps I could find someone to help your highness. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, go ahead. So the girl went and called the child's own mother. Now, can you picture Jochebed? In her eagerness, she must have longed to sprint to that riverbank, but she had to play the part of a respectful but disinterested female slave. She had to remain calm. She couldn't show any signs of recognition. She mustn't allow her eyes to shine with love and tenderness for that crying infant. No trembling hands, no quick breathing, no catch in her voice or tears in her eyes. The life of her little son was at stake. And here's what happened next. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages. Did you catch that? You not only get your child back from the edge of the grave, you not only get the official sanction and protection of Pharaoh's daughter, but you get paid to raise him. How many of you wish the government would pay you to raise your child? You get paid to raise your own child. God says, you know what? I'm going to reward your faith. Not only are you going to get him, and she would have been happy just being able to take and raise him. That would have been a reward enough. But God says, I got more than that for you. You're going to get paid. She is the only Hebrew, I was going to say woman, but actually probably the only Hebrew, period, actually receiving a wage. Every other Hebrew is working as slaves for no pay, and she is getting paid to raise her own son. He goes on to say, that, my friend, is no coincidence. That is the hand of God. Scripture tells us, when a man's ways are pleasant to the Lord, he makes even his enemies live at peace with him. That's Proverbs chapter 16, verse 7. We aren't told how old Moses was when his mother had to turn him over to Pharaoh's daughter. Most Bible scholars and historians think it was probably around the age of 5 or 6. They think that he was raised by his real mother through his preschool years, and about the time that he would start school, probably didn't have kindergarten back then, probably about the time it would be equivalent to our first grade. That's probably about the time that she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, because legally it wasn't her son, it was Pharaoh's daughter's son. Knowing they only had a few short years to invest in their son before he would be turned over to a totally godless education, I'm sure Moses' parents would have worked overtime to teach him everything they could about God and faith, saying, we only have a few short years here. We're not going to wait. We're going to start teaching him the word of God now. We're going to start teaching him. Of course, they didn't have the written word yet. Moses is the one that started writing that. but teaching him everything they could about God, about the right way to live. Acts chapter 7, verse 22 says, Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians. This is after he went to live with his Egyptian mom. He was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians. Historians believe he more than likely went to school at the Temple of the Sun. Archaeologists and historians have called the Temple of the Sun the Oxford of the ancient world. While he was there, he would have learned to read and to write. He was going to need those skills later because he wrote the first 5 books of the Bible. God said, I've got a plan for this man. He's not going to learn it with his real mom and dad because the Hebrews didn't even have a written language back then. Their written language didn't happen until 400 or 500 years after the stuff we're reading about. God said, I've got a plan for him. Part of that plan is that he's going to be the one to start writing the Bible. I've got to get him educated so he can actually write. So God takes him to an Egyptian school to learn how to write. Probably hieroglyphics. He wasn't writing in English. But he learned to write. While he was there, he would have studied science, medicine, astronomy, chemistry, philosophy, and law. And unbeknownst to Moses, all of these things that he's learning was part of God's plan. Many of those things he learned while in the Egyptian schools he was going to need later in life. None of them would have been learned as a common Israelite. As a result of his education, Acts 7:22 goes on to say, because of the education he received in Egypt, he became powerful in speech and in action. The first century historian Josephus wrote that after Moses finished his education, he became the general of the Egyptian army, and he helped the Egyptians win victory after victory. God was making sure that Moses had all the skills that he would need to accomplish the task that he had been preordained for. Moses had risen to become a very powerful man in Egypt. But then something happened that brought him from the pinnacle of success to the bottom of the heap. Chapter 2, starting at verse 11, we read this. Many years later, because it skips that whole part about him being educated. She turned him over to Pharaoh's daughter. Then it jumps to this. Many years later, when Moses had grown up, he went out to visit his own people, the Hebrews, and he saw how hard they were forced to work. During his visit, he saw an Egyptian beating one of his fellow Hebrews. After looking in all directions to make sure no one was watching, Moses killed the Egyptian and hid his body in the sand. God has predestined Moses to be a deliverer. He has predestined Moses to deliver the Israelites. Possibly during those early years at home before he was turned over, maybe his mom and dad had instilled that in him and said, you know what, the angel appeared to us. We don't know that's what happened, but if it did, somehow they knew. Maybe they had told him, you know what, you're special. Do you realize there are no other little boys your age? You're the only one. There's other girls, but there's no boys. You know what? That's because God has plans for you. When you grow up, you're going to be our deliverer. You're going to be the one to set us free from all this captivity. You're going to set us free from this slavery. Is it possible that's in the back of his mind? And so now he sees it, says, I better start delivering. I'm going to start right here. I'm going to deliver this one person. God didn't want him to deliver them one at a time. God had greater plans. Moses actually stepped out, and he got ahead of God, stepped out of God's plan here and took matters into his own hand because something inside of him, he was hardwired to be a deliverer. It was in his DNA. He couldn't ignore injustice. When he saw somebody being abused, he says, my job is to deliver them. I've got to do something. But he went about it the wrong way. At this point in his life, he might have accomplished more by using his political clout. He's already a successful general. People already respect him. He might be better off to use his political clout. In fact, I don't have time to go into this, but it's really interesting studying Moses and the history around that time. Many historians, by looking at the timelines and stuff, they believe that his mother was Hophanot. I think that's how you pronounce it, was Hophanot, who actually became the leader of Egypt for a period of about 20 years. It was supposed to go to her brother, but he ruled for a couple years and died, and her other brothers were all too young to rule. So for a period of 20 years, this woman ruled Egypt, and it might have been during this time that his mom was actually the leader, and actually she was supposed to turn it over to one of her younger brothers later, but she proved herself, and people started to like her so well that she was a forceful person, and she pushed her way in there, and actually she started dressing like a man and even put on a fake pharaoh goatee. So the people even forgot that she was a woman, and she ruled for a period of 20 years. And it's possible during that time, his mom might actually be the one that's ruling Egypt during this time. Maybe if he got back and said, Mom, you know what? I know we got the slaves and stuff, but do we have to beat them? Can't we find another way of doing it? Maybe he would have accomplished more by actually doing something political instead of killing the Egyptians. I don't know. That's all speculation. It's just kind of interesting when you study and what it could have been like there at that time. Moses made sure that nobody was watching. But the slave that he rescued must have told all his friends, because by the next day, all of Israel knew what had happened. In verse 13, we read this. The next day, when Moses went out to visit his people again, he saw 2 Hebrew men fighting. Why are you beating up your friend? Moses said to the one who had started the fight. The man replied, who appointed you to be our prince and judge? Are you going to kill me as you did that Egyptian yesterday? Nobody saw that, but word had spread. Then Moses was afraid, thinking everyone knows what I did. And sure enough, Pharaoh heard what had happened. And this kind of tells me it's not his mom, right? He tried to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in the land of Midian. When Moses arrived in Midian, he sat down beside a well. Now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters who came as usual to draw water and fill the water troughs for their father's flocks. But some other shepherds came and chased them away. So Moses, the rescuer, the deliverer, jumped up and rescued the girls from the shepherds. Then he drew water for their flocks. There's Moses. It's in his DNA. God set him up to be a deliverer. He can't help but deliver people. He's just got to do it. That's who he is. There's somebody in need. I got to rescue them. So he's using a spiritual gift of deliverance again. That's not one we see in Corinthians, but he has a spiritual gift of deliverance. Verse 18, when the girls returned to Reuel, their father, he asked, why are you back so soon today? An Egyptian rescued us from the shepherds, they answered. And then he drew water for us and watered our flocks. Then where is he? Their father asked. Why did you leave him there? Invite him to come and eat with us. Moses accepted the invitation and he settled there with them. In time, Reuel gave Moses his daughter Zipporah to be his wife. Later, she gave birth to a son, and Moses named him Gershom, for he explained, I have been a foreigner in a foreign land. This is a low point in Moses' life. He must have somehow known that God called him to be the deliverer of his people. But now he's been rejected by both his own people, the Israelites, and by the Egyptians. How can he deliver anyone when he's living in Midian, except for the Midian girls that are coming to water their flocks? But he says, you know what, I blew it. I guess I'll never accomplish God's purpose for me. I've made some mistakes, my fault. I guess I'm just going to have to just settle down here, live in the wilderness for the rest of my life. And he did pretty much live in the wilderness the rest of his life, but for other reasons. We'll get to that. He settled into his new life in Midian. This former highly educated general became a shepherd. As far as the Egyptians were concerned, if they had known where he was and what he was doing, he had dropped all the way from the top. He was very well respected, very high up in Egypt, and now he's a shepherd. In the eyes of the Egyptians, there was nothing worse than being a shepherd. That was the lowest of the low. You could not get any worse than that. So Moses is probably feeling like a failure about now. But God isn't done with him yet. God's going to spend 40 years of wilderness to further Moses' education and teach him some additional things that he needs to know. He's got all the education that he got in Egypt, but now he needs a wilderness education before he's completely ready. The skills he will learn here, added to the skills and education gained in Egypt, will prepare him for the astronomical task that God has waiting for him. There's no such thing as failure if we learn from our mistakes. And there is no task that is too menial to be valid. You may find yourself in a position right now, in a job right now, you say, this is worthless. Why am I here? This wasn't the plans I had for myself. Why would God allow me to go through this? You know what? If you're there, God knows you're there. He hasn't forgotten you. And if you will keep him as number one in your life, keep honoring him, learn the lessons that he has for you to learn there. It took Moses 40 years. But God brought him out of it. He had some lessons to learn first. Simply trust God. Say, God, I know you've got great plans for me, and I'm willing to do this to learn what I need to learn so that you can take me to the next step. Sometimes we're where we are because of mistakes that we've made. Other times we're simply victims of unfortunate events. But even those are usually orchestrated by God. And if we don't give up, God will take even those low points in our lives to build us up, to make us stronger. James talks about it. Count it all joy when you suffer trials of many kinds. Because those trials, those low points, they build our faith. They give us perseverance. They make us stronger. God's not done with Moses yet. Even though he might feel like a failure right now, God's using everything that has happened to him to mold him and to make him one of the greatest leaders that has ever lived. I don't know what's going on in your life right now. Maybe some of you feel like you've made so many mistakes that there's no way you'll ever amount to anything. There's no way God can use me. With all the mistakes I've made, I've blown it. I'm never going to amount to anything. The devil would like for you to wallow in your misery and give up. But I've got good news for you. God's not finished with you yet. It might take a while. Hopefully not as long as Moses. It took Moses 40 years in that position. But still, God brought him out of it. It might take a while. But God always has a plan. And no matter how bad things may look right now, God is able to accomplish his plan if we keep our faith in him. At this point, it doesn't say what's going on in the minds of Moses' Israelite parents. For all they know, he's dead. Here they had a promise from God. Their son is going to be the deliverer. Where is he? Last we heard, he ran off into the wilderness somewhere, probably got eaten by wild animals, probably died out there from the hot sun. They think God's forgotten even them. What happened to that promise that God had given them? God hadn't forgotten. God keeps his promises. If God's given you a promise, don't give up on it. Hold on to it. You may have no idea right now how that's ever going to be fulfilled. But God's still working. And no matter what mistakes you've made, God could even take those mistakes and use them for education. Simply say, God, I don't understand. I don't know what's going on here, but God, I trust you. And God will elevate you. We're going to see that about Moses as we continue the story. God will take you from the lowest of lows. Maybe not put you quite as high up as Moses. Moses, he had extreme highs and he had extreme lows. But God will use you if you don't give up. Heavenly Father, I don't know what's going on in the lives of people in this room today. I don't believe this message today was by accident. There's somebody in this room that needed to hear this morning. For a lot of people, it might just be, that's just kind of a neat story. And maybe someone will say, hey, I learned a few things about the story I didn't know before. But there's somebody here, maybe several somebodies here, who needed this morning. You knew they were going to be here, and you just happened to have this message fall on this day. because they're at a point where they're about to give up. They're beating themselves up, or the devil's beating them up about mistakes that they've made. They're looking at where they've been and where they are now and where they'd like to be, and they're saying, there's no way. I pray that you would help to encourage them this morning, that they would understand you're still in control. Even when it looks like you've lost control, you're still in control. You still hold the world. You still hold all of us in the palm of your hand. And whatever people may be going through this morning, I pray they would simply turn it over to you and say, God, I don't understand. I'm hoping this leaves quickly. I don't want to carry this for years, but God, I'm willing to put up with whatever, because I trust you to take even this. I believe that all things work together for good. Even the bad things work together for good. God, I have faith. You will keep your promises. You will accomplish your purposes in my life. Thank you, Jesus.